Welcome to Microcollege. This week on the podcast, we are really excited to welcome back a friend and a former team member here at Thoreau College. This is Dr. Evan Edwards, PhD, which is really fun to be able to say that, Evan.
Yeah, thank you.
Evan was our very first resident, and it's fun to be able to talk about this little-known part of Thoreau College, our residency program. We now are going on to our fourth resident, but Evan was our first. Basically, a resident is a person, generally someone working on a big project, PhD dissertation in Evan's case. We've had people work on creative writing projects and artists, different things like that. People who come, they're working on their creative project. They're part of our faculty, part of our community. And in Evan's case, he was also our chef, our food coordinator. Dr. Evan Edwards is a philosopher of food and hospitality. He has his doctorate from DePaul University. Recently finished his doctoral defense that he was working on here on the subject of Autotrophy of the other, on food and hospitality. He's also developing ideas for a microcollege of his own over in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and will be starting this fall as an associate professor at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So if you've listened to the podcast at all, we start with the same question always. And that question is, where were you when you were 18 to 21 years old? What were you doing? And what was shaping you and your life during that period?
Yeah. So I grew up in a restaurant family. My family had a restaurant, pizza place in Raleigh, Durham, sort of Piedmont area of North Carolina. And so I grew up working around the restaurant, working with my dad in particular. And as I went on, through my teens, kind of the main thing that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but the one thing that I was absolutely certain that I didn't want to do was work in restaurants. And so I picked what I thought would be the furthest thing from working in restaurants, which was going to university and studying, in some sense, like the most abstracted from everyday life thing that I could possibly think of, which was philosophy. I went to a relatively small liberal arts college in North Carolina, up in the mountains, UNC Asheville. It is the only public liberal arts school in North Carolina. And I actually initially went in for creative writing. I wanted to write poetry and then realized I was no good at that. And started taking courses with a professor there, Dr. Dwayne Davis. He focused on sort of 19th century German, 20th century French philosophy, phenomenology, existentialism. So it was really right up my alley. He was also a teacher in the humanities program that we had there. So we had a 4-year program where, as we were taking classes in various subjects from across the liberal arts spectrum, we were also doing this, one course a year where we were tracing kind of liberal arts throughout the ages. And so I took philosophy courses there, particularly courses that Dr. Davis was running. So anytime he had a seminar class, I jumped in on that, and used that as a jumping off point for thinking about the various ways that people have approached thought in the history of European culture in particular, European American culture. And as I went through, I found that I did very well in philosophy courses. I was, in this program that was, or program in college that was really focused on taking any subject that you were in and finding all of the connections, the historical context that gave rise to whatever thought was happening in that time to sort of make it more concrete, bring it down to earth. And so I over time, right, as I was taking these philosophy courses, mostly because I was interested in the professors in the department. It was a very wide, diverse department. Found that philosophy was really where I wanted to be, because again, it was like so far away from the world that I'd grown up in. And so that kind of set me on a trajectory just to go into grad school. I guess that starts getting out of that 21-year-old period. But in college, really, mostly focused on thought philosophy was the way to go. And again, that sent me down towards grad school further on the line.
Philosophy and avoidance of restaurants, right?
Yes, exactly.
So that naturally brings us to the next twist of this, which leads you to be a highly skilled and practiced chef. So how did that twist happen?
Yeah. So through schooling, I was working in restaurants in varying capacities for that period of time, all the way up through kind of the end of grad school. Worked at a very mostly just kind of side gigs, working at a pizza place as an undergrad, working in some coffee shops, a small anarchist restaurant bookstore in Asheville. I had 1 full year working in a professional chef-run kitchen in Indianapolis in the year between undergrad and grad school. Basically, as soon as you're in the restaurant world, you can be in it for life, right? And the question is, do you get out or not, right?
Just like prison or something, right?
It sometimes feels like it. There's this book, The Anarchist Cookbook, and at the very beginning, it's like, signed like the people that got out of the restaurant industry or something, who escaped it, right? It sometimes feels like that, and so I just kept coming back to it, mostly for money, but also just because it was a skill set that I had that I'd been developing. I went vegan when I was 19 years old, and that was a time when, of course, there are vegan, vegetarian things available in the world, especially in a place like Asheville, but it's not a thing that you can get everywhere you go, and so and it's kind of was kind of expensive, a little bit inaccessible at the time. So that pushed me to also start thinking about how to cook my own food a little bit more. And so I went through grad school. I got my master's in 2014 and started teaching. And around 2018, late 2017, early 2018, I started working on my first iteration of my doctoral dissertation. It was on Thoreau and Emerson and Whitman. And this is, where we met at the Thoreau Society around this time, and had a son around this time as well. And my partner at the time and I decided, I was burned out. Teaching didn't seem like it was really the thing for me. Couldn't get my dissertation done. Living in the city had kind of put a severe strain on our relationship, and we're thinking about, what the next steps were. And so I needed to get away. So I essentially dropped out of grad school, moved to Michigan, and stepped away from a lot of different things in my life at that point. And the thing that was there to catch me was restaurant work. And so, I had basically gone as far as I could on that track of academia, right? I'd pretty much gotten to the end of the line, and all I had left to do was write my dissertation. And had a moment where I thought, maybe this isn't for me after all. I've been doing this had been doing it for almost 15 years in higher education at that point. And it wasn't very fulfilling for me. The dissertation that I was writing was something I was very interested in, but it was felt very abstract. I didn't see what the point of it was. It felt like just kind of putting a puzzle together out of other people's words rather than something that I could get my hands on. And as I went back into restaurant work in 2018 to mostly just make a living. I was equipped with all of these tools, right, for thinking for the last that I'd gathered for the last 15 years or so, and started to get more serious about food and thinking about food and bringing these tools to reflect on what I was doing in the kitchen, how a kitchen operated, the politics and ethics of it, and so started kind of documenting that process with primarily through Instagram and some blogging, and got a really great job at a place called Grove in Grand Rapids. It's just one of these consistently award-winning restaurants that is very humble about it. The chefs there are extraordinarily talented and very focused on the work. And so I got kind of a crash course in, basically I went in thinking that I'd been in restaurants forever. I know how to cook, and was shown that was very, very quickly that I had a lot to learn. So started from the ground up there and learned, felt like I had a crash course in culinary education at that point. And that hit a reset on what I thought about food and restaurants. And from there have been, trying to figure out how to bring those two threads of my life together. Around that time, 2019 or so, I started doing a summer dinner series where I was working with local farms, bringing the farmers out to the dinner, buying all the produce from this one place, wherever it was that we were talking about. And that's been a thread of most of the summers since then. And so, ended up where I thought I was getting away from. But, it was the fact that food had such a concrete, everyday, relevance to people's lives that felt like, it was a correction for the extreme kind of feeling of abstraction that I'd gotten in grad school.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, that you were a perfect person for Thoreau College, in that you were, doing philosophy, doing intellectual work, writing, reading very seriously, translating things from different languages, and doing something highly skilled and practical at a high level. And then it was fun to watch you here, I would say, bringing those things closer and closer together, applying philosophy to food, but also food to philosophy. Right. And that, you mentioned we met in the context of the Thoreau Society. And it's certainly something that I value about those thinkers, Thoreau and Emerson, is the way that they are talking about the relationship between the practical and the intellectual, kind of, and applying that, especially in Thoreau's case. Really, let's figure out what we're going to eat by thinking about it and thinking and applying what you do practically to your thinking in a way that enriches your thinking. Yeah. Can you think about? So bring us the next step there. So you came here. This is in the context of COVID year. You were here in Viroqua during the fall of 2020, we created together here, I think, a bubble, it felt like a place of sanctuary, I think, for a lot of us, a lot of the students we had. We had Moriel and Brandon on the podcast a couple weeks ago, and they were students here during that same time. And food is a really important part of that, and you were part of that. What is? Can you think about the role of cooking and food and thinking about food in an educational context? What does that bring into it?
Yeah, I think maybe one way of approaching this is just kind of thinking about what the coming into the program at all, right? So, I had been so involved in, again, just the nitty-gritty of the mechanics of cooking and learning to cook that I'd wanted to reflect on what I'd been doing for a couple of years, but the restaurant industry it's grueling.
Right.
And so I hadn't really had the time, energy to do that. And so when COVID hit, I was unemployed, right? The restaurant that I was working at the time shut down. And was not going to be open for the foreseeable future. So it kind of felt like, that was the time when I could maybe sit down and try writing my dissertation again. So that summer leading up to coming to Viroqua or coming to Thoreau, I started writing, some of the first chapter or two of the dissertation, and then remembered some of the conversations that you and I had had between meeting in Concord and that point, and realized that it might be nice to have a place where I could, not be too far on either end of the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. Either I'd been in academia just doing kind of an abstract thing, or just in a restaurant just doing the practical thing. And so being here felt like a really great opportunity to do a little bit of both. Use the educational part of what was happening here to, not only think for myself, right, but basically use teaching and conversations with students as a way of clarifying some of the ideas mm-hmm. that I had been thinking, and see the practical application of the skills and ideas that had been coming up in that summer leading up, and so that fall was a really, maybe this is something that we want to come back to later, but it's a really unique experience in that being able to, I had been teaching for 6 years at that point in a large university setting, and had never really felt like I had the opportunity to get very close to students. And, it's just basically we'd show up and talk for an hour and a half, and then I wouldn't see them. And it occurred to me that there is so much of, so many of the ideas that we talk about in philosophy make much more sense and have, they stick whenever they are encountered in living contexts, mm-hmm. right? And so one thing that was incredibly special about this place was that, I think I had a few formal classroom engagements with the students outside of just sitting in on your class and some of the other classes.
Right. You had us read Husserl and Heidegger, yes. if I remember. And certainly I learned a lot more about those than I ever knew before. So, but that's the kind of stuff you were bringing. That was awesome. And
so we had those kind of formal classroom discussions, but it felt like most of the opportunities that I had to teach and to engage in learning with students was when they came in to do the afternoon cooking sessions, right? So we'd had this work period after the midday break, when some students would come to me and in the kitchen and prep food for the coming days and preserve some stuff and work on some more long-term projects. And then there were plenty of evenings when I went to the students' houses and we cooked and ate together. Mm-hmm. And we talked about a lot of stuff during those times, right? A lot of it was practical, here's how to hold a knife, and here's why this preservation technique works for this thing, but not that thing. But also, as we're talking, we're having dialogue, and ideas just kind of organically began to emerge from the conversations we were having. Felt much more, Socratic, much more organic than sitting some students down in a classroom and saying, Socrates said this, right? And it's just this complete abstract, unrelated to everybody's everyday life. And so, things I think stick with you much more deeply when they come up in a living context than they do in a lecture hall. And so, I was talking to Laura and Mari and Brandon recently, and there are these small snippets of ideas that maybe we could have got into them in some sense more deeply if we spent an hour talking about this one passage in a book, but they are like woven into the fabric of their everyday life, things that they're doing every day, in a way that is much more getting into their mental ecology in a much deeper way, I think, than in a classroom setting. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, that's great. I mean, what's striking from what you said there, when I talk to people who've done graduate school, and there's a lot of like critiques about that and regrets about how much time and cost it might take. But but also that when people remember positive things, a lot of times what comes up are the informal relationships they have with professors and with their peers, right? And that'll happen sometimes in the context of the professor's home around meals and things like that, or at conferences, but informal settings, often around food. And I think what's cool about what you did here, and in some sense what a microcollege is able to do in general with scope and scale, is to create that environment for people who are not in graduate school as a primary form of higher education.
Right. Yeah, and the conversations that happen with colleagues and professors around the dinner table. I mean, one thing that felt so interesting and fulfilling about the kind of thinking and research and writing that I was doing here is that it's one thing to have ideas emerge around the dinner table over the nature of the soul and all of this stuff. It's something very different to be thinking about thinking deeply about food while you're eating and making food, and if that's your subject matter, then it's like every time you pick up a knife, you're thinking about the significance of cutting into a body or something, right? And so the resonances are there in that way where the informal conversation gives rise to meaningful experiences, but it's also tied into, what you're actually doing at that moment, which was really special. Yeah.
When this airs and people first hear this or have the opportunity to hear it, we'll be here in the fall of 2023 and digging into our new fall semester with a block, beginning a month or so, really focused on homemaking, especially on food, harvest season here in the Northern Hemisphere, and kind of curating the readings and stuff for that. And Thoreau's chapter in Walden about eating, about food is higher laws, right? He goes to the most high kind of philosophical and ethical considerations in the context of should we eat meat, or what is the simplest diet one could or should eat, and what is the relationship to thinking and to the moral life, right? And that comes right out of that the most practical of things. What should we eat or not eat, and how should we do it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like I think of this sometimes in the context of going back to like rereading. I'm working on a syllabus for this fall for the class that I'm doing, and going back and reading a lot of the Socratic dialogues, right? The reason why they have such staying power is because they're out in the marketplace and sees somebody there who is is doing some kind of work, right? Or there's not a dialogue about shoemaking, right? But
he's always referencing the shoemakers, so the ship makers, the horse trainers, all that. Yeah.
Right. And so it's like this like that's in many ways where philosophy begins, which is like looking at the world around you and working your way, or noticing that like the seed of these really seemingly abstract, otherworldly concepts, right, are there. The seeds are in the soil of everyday life, and again, and food is exceptional among all of these everyday experiences, I think, because it's one thing to talk about the shoemaker when most of us aren't making our own shoes, right? But everybody has to eat multiple times a day, right? And so there are, I think, there's opportunities to think about the significance of food and eating and cooking and what it means to bring another body into your own body we have an unlimited, as long as we're living, right? An unlimited opportunity to think about these things, and that I think sometimes means that they're the first. It's the first place that we tend to overlook those things because it's such an everyday experience that everybody has. Yeah.
Yeah. And so your work, the work that you were sharing with us in progress here at several points throughout your semester here, and the bits and pieces I've seen it along the way. I haven't had a chance yet to read your dissertation, but it was striking that you were bringing in, of course, philosophers and your own practical experience, but you also were bringing in a lot of storytelling, a lot of Greek myths, and the mythology around eating and around hosts and guests and hospitality and things like that. So that what do those stories, mythology, what does that bring into this dynamic?
Well, okay. So the best way to get to this, in philosophy in particular, right? We tend to, in some way, kind of always make our way back to the Greeks, in a lot of ways. Particularly in the thing that we call the canon, right? And when it feels like one thing to go back and look at the logical arguments and the way that dialectic works and understand the history of philosophy as a footnote to Plato or however you want to read it, and it felt like I could do that, and there's a lot of there's so much good material out there on the philosophy, the relation between how we think now and the sort of conceptual apparatus and logical structure of the arguments that I felt like I would never be able to make a dent in it. And so I started thinking about the way that those arguments and those the sort of logical, rational structures that emerged in that time are all couched in a set of mythologies that are, the frame for what we think is the star of the show, right? The logical arguments. And so what I wanted to do, and why I come back and many points in the dissertation to mythology, is because I think that there are there is a lot of sort of baseline assumptions and conditions for thought that emerge from a certain telling of the mythologies, right? So Plato is awash in a whole series of stories that are being told that are, again, creating the conditions for how the logic emerges, right?
Stories within stories within stories sometimes, yeah.
And so I wanted to go back and look at some of the myths and, read them in a slightly different way in order to see if there is maybe another trajectory of thought that takes off from that same kind of, sea of stories, right? That might give a different context to, the logical structures that we've been working with for the last 2,000 years. So in the dissertation, particularly focus on, maybe two sets of stories. The first is, this is later Roman stuff, but it's drawing on the Greek myths in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which fits very well with Thoreau College, the themes that emerge here, and some of the stories in Ovid's Metamorphoses that there are I think really crucial moments in that story that revolve around food, right? So you get the story of Lycaon at the beginning, and the destruction of the world because of improper food and hospitality. Then directly in the middle, you get the story of Baucis and Philemon and their, a retelling of the destruction of the world myth, again, halfway through the book, and it plays out in a very different way because of the way that they are hospitable and the way that they feed Zeus and Hermes. And then at the very end, there is the speech of Pythagoras that really gives kind of an overview of the ideas that have been bubbling throughout the whole of the story, and you get sort of a explicit drawing out of the ideas that had been told in mythical ways up until that point. So there's a couple, going over those stories a couple times. They keep bubbling up throughout the dissertation. And then the other one that really felt like, and this is something that I hadn't really thought about until I got here, and came across this story and had some great conversations with faculty here about the mythology of Persephone and Demeter. It was harvest time when I was here, and thinking about the changing of the seasons and what are, we were already talking about the nature of the changing of the seasons. And so that myth in particular seemed to actually fit in many ways with as a really great overarching frame for the argument that I was laying out in the dissertation, because of the proximity of food and metamorphosis and change and in particular plant life to this whole story. And so that ended up being the introduction, and Persephone comes up time and time again throughout the dissertation. Because if you, I think the last thing that I'd say about this is just that, like, some of the ideas that come up relatively early in the dissertation are, it's tied very deeply to the canon of Western philosophy, but it's also kind of way far out, right? The first chapter is like, imagine a world where, what if the first thing that we thought whenever we're trying to think about the world is a giant organism that is eating itself, right?
Autotrophy.
Right, yeah. And so I thought that putting the Persephone myth and framing that in a particular way at the beginning is a way of kind of, it's the, thing that you get at the beginning of the some of the myths, right? Like, oh muse, tell me your story. So you start off with this myth, and it gets you primed, right? It sets up your brain by telling a story in a way that, in particular, some of the more recent philosophy, German philosophy in the 19th century in particular, is like, we're going to start with a indubitable principle and, deduce everything from there. It seemed like a better way of getting into some of these ideas by telling a story, setting a vibe, setting like
setting the table, as it were.
Yeah, setting the table, right? And then from there, it's a lot easier. If you're just working within a mythological framework, to draw out some of the more concrete, rational principles. Yeah.
I really appreciated that, and I think it fits into, as you say, with what we're doing here at Thoreau College. I think when people, we step back and think about, we do several different types of programs here with different sort of groups of people, but the fundamental curriculum is always the same, and that is the seasons, right? And the agricultural year, and once you start to meditate on that, and you start to find stories like that, the Demeter and Persephone kind of myth, and they are often also, you can think of it through the lens of the plant world and the cycle of the plant world here, especially in the temperate climates where we have this cycle of growth and transformation and death and fruiting and going to seed, right? That's so much of our mythological and cultural heritage comes out of that, and including the festivals, which then they become the Christian festivals and the Celtic and Germanic and Greco-Roman festivals, different ones in the Native American world, but there really are they're connected to that cycle, and keying into those engaging practically with harvesting, planting, you start to notice that, you start to see it in our just everyday American traditions. Jack-o'-lanterns, Christmas trees, Easter lilies. There are plants and parts of the plant cycle that are associated with our holidays as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's I don't know. It's like the kind of when I was working with these students here, there was a familiarity with a lot of these stories, but some of the reticence to get into these stories is that much of the way that we've told them, for especially passing through the sort of Christian framework, are traumatic and violent and can be very misogynistic, and so when I was talking to some of these students who are very tuned into questions of social justice and inclusion, and we're talking about Persephone in particular, right? There's it's a story of an abducted child, and there's a lot of violence involved, and so it felt really important to revisit contemporary retellings of those myths, and to think about what's really at work in those myths, that isn't just reductive to, or can't just be dismissed as a patriarchal, violent, xenophobic, right? I mean, those things are definitely there, but if you revisit the stories and retell them in a living context, then you can draw out different aspects of them and see how maybe there are parts of them that can still be have living relevance for us today in the 21st century.
Yeah, one of the things I see students experience here, especially from other climates, is if they're here for the fall, especially in the spring, it's a different cycle. Is the trauma of winter, right? You go from things die kind of all of a sudden, and or gradually, and there's a loss there, and that there's a sadness in that time of the year when that's happening, and a lot of these festivals are about recognizing that and acknowledging that in different ways, and then kindling something to come, a seed for the future in a way. And that's why myth has that function. It is actually to allow us to work with the traumas that are existing in our world, also human society, but even right there in the natural order.
Right. Yeah. And being at Thoreau College, where there's the Waldorf schools here that are working so. I came in with a knowledge of mythology. I've been thinking about myths for a long time, and thinking particularly in that Greek tradition for a long time. But seeing a town and a community here that has so much of that knowledge, and particularly the Waldorf school, the way that it builds mythology into the curriculum. It felt like I was able to revisit a lot of them in a new way, and so it really kicked off a new period of thinking about these myths, and in a way that I looked around, and all of a sudden everybody around me, all the other faculty and the students who had grown up in these schools who were here, we're already familiar with them, right? So it didn't have to lay all the groundwork. We could just kind of work with this material, and that was really special.
I'm chuckling because I was saying that I've one of my children, my daughter who just finished fifth grade, and fifth grade is when they study the Greeks in the Waldorf school, and she at the very end, the last day of school, kind of as somehow connected with the eighth graders graduating from school, her fifth grade class performed a little play. They do a big play, but this was like a just a 5-6 minute thing at the end of as part of the assembly at the end of school, and it was the myth of Prometheus.
Okay.
And my daughter got to play the eagle, which eats Prometheus' liver.
Amazing.
And so, who knows what seeds that's planting for a group of fifth graders to enact that, and to think about that, and where that will come back. Down. Next time they encounter that myth, they'll have a visceral experience. there's
Right. Yeah. And just thinking of the Prometheus, there's there's a writing project in my mind for the future. Finally got some time this fall to do some new work, right? I finished my dissertation last year, and I'm going to be have some time to write what's coming next soon. And so one of the things bouncing around my head is the Prometheus story, because one thing that really became apparent to me when I was here and has been been coming up time and time again since then is that like so many of these myths have really deep connections to, not only life in general, and we can still draw resources from them, but specifically, have to do with food and cooking, right? And I think that, we miss a lot of that in our contemporary world, or like the resonances that it has to do with food, because so much of our food is packaged, it's pre-processed. It's not something that we really have to work for. Some people never have to, because of the way that the food system is set up, even do any cooking themselves, right? Or engage with flame and the significance of the coming of fire, right? And so like the Prometheus story, it's interesting to revisit a lot of these myths in the context of doing philosophy of food, because I think not only does it tell us things about who we are today, but also lights up a bunch of connections in our understanding of the context in which they were told, and makes them less of this kind of abstract, some guy on top of the mountain getting his liver poked out, right? And thinking about the kind of the importance and the heroism of this character for creating a condition that really changes us, right? It's not just that we get fire. Sure, we get fire and that changes things, but really think about what it means to be able to cook now, right?
Right. It's the birth of cookery, of cooking.
Changes everything, right? And so it's interesting to go back, whether you're interested in the myths or not, to go back and look at them in the light of their relation to this very everyday project of making and producing and cooking and consuming and sharing food, because that is one activity that is at least in it's possible, right? That we're doing the same thing that the Greeks were doing, right? Growing food, harvesting it, cooking it, sharing with other people. So there's this kind of cross-cultural, of course, we all eat in different ways, right? And we have different stories about this, but everybody eats, and we can see the significance of these, because it's not like there's some things when you go back and read the Greeks that they really don't have much significance anymore, because we have modern medicine, or we have whatever new technologies, the stories about the moon or whatever. It's hard to connect with it, right? But the food way into these myths is we're still doing it. It's cross time and space, right?
Yeah, in a culture where many people have not grown up in a religious context, or have changed religions, or they've had a lot of autonomy in shaping themselves. Food remains a bearer of culture in a unique way, right? Their ethnic cuisine, or their household, their family, or even their self-definition. If the person decides to become a vegan, or to just leave being veganism or whatever, that's an important rite of transition and of cultural awakening for many people. That remains pertinent, because you have to decide what you eat one way or another.
One way or another, yeah. It's a question that interestingly you can return to every time you sit down at a table, right? It's one of these living questions of what we should eat and how we should eat, because we have to deal with it so much. It's never even people who are vegan, right, and have a very or relatively clear picture of what to eat, how to eat it, when to eat it, like there's always the opportunity to answer that question in another way, and it's never a closed question, right? How we should act, or how we should engage with this. It is part of the developing and changing story of our lives, and it's a really powerful place to revisit our definitions of ourselves and how we relate to the people around us in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So when after your time here, I can see that it was really, you were gestating your eventual dissertation in really clear ways that you've been talking about here. You went back and you did some more restaurant cooking, including a residency recently in Detroit, which you might talk about. But one of the things, you also have been working on some ideas of how to build a microcollege initiative, potentially around food and cooking specifically. And I know that there's been some, you talk about that, the idea, and you have done some prototyping, I think, about that.
Yeah, once again, very similarly to, this period between 2018 and 2020, I've been working in restaurants for the last couple of years, came back from the most intense period of lockdown, and I have been working at a restaurant fittingly called Gaia for the last 2 years. Stephanie's grandma, great grandmother, right? So doing that, and then I've also been teaching at DePaul, teaching at DePaul for the last year and a half on agricultural history. It's been a very busy couple of years, and so some of this has been on the back burner, but I have a little bit more space and time to revisit it. I have an idea of how a microcollege would work, mostly because of the experience that I had here at Thoreau. Right, I looked around and saw the way that the economics of this school could work and were working, and how labor and education fit together in a way that could, point towards a self-sustaining institution that brings together, right, this very practical and always necessary skill of producing, processing, and consuming food, right? Mm-hmm. So agriculture, cooking, and hospitality, which are the three pillars of the dissertation as well, right? Looking at these 3 points, have been kicking around the idea, letting it kind of ferment for the last couple of years. A school that would be based around, and starting to make some strides toward it with the connections that I've been making for the last couple of years. That would involve a sort of farm branch, right, where we're growing food and students are learning how to engage with the land and engage with soil, and then a branch that makes the food and sells it, and then some part of the track that would be students learning how to enact hospitality, right, and think, and in a way that would give them an education, right, reflection on all of these steps of the food process, or the provisioning process, while at the same time doing some kind of activity that is viable in a market economy, right? And it's really it seems like one of the issues in thinking of how to get a college or a university off the ground these days is that large universities and all levels of the higher education, in some ways, except for the microcollege movement, right, have been so deeply altered by the fact that they are embedded in a market economy. And so, yeah, how do you create a community of learners that is, focused on learning that doesn't break the bank for students, right? Like one of the amazing things about Thoreau is the way that how accessible it is, right? And a lot of that comes from the community connections that you and others here have been, drawing on and nurturing for your whole life and the life of others in the school. But it also brings in relies on with the garden, for example, right? Doing work that helps sort of in some sense like subsidize the education so that students aren't interacting with it just as a commodity, right? I mean, large universities come in, pay your money, and
soft serve ice cream.
Yeah, exactly. Crank out the diploma or something. And it seems like this, what you're doing here, and what some of these other sort of microcolleges that are, centering or incorporating labor into the education process are trying to make sense of how to not make it just a commodity, but something that you are actively involved in, right? Part of your living labor, right?
What was striking me as your story, and very, very, very common story, person goes to college, and how do they pay to go to college? They work in a restaurant. They work in the food service industry, but it's in a totally another place, a place that they it's kind of sometimes a drag. It's competing with their schedule and time. It's maybe like fast food or a place where the food is bad or is something that is at least they're totally disconnected from in some way. And of course, they're also eating, and a lot of times eating the same sort of stuff, whether it's in a cafeteria or off campus. And then they go back and try to think about things, right, separately. And certainly an impulse of this sort of holistic education that Thoreau College is a part of is, can we put those pieces back together in a thoughtful, aesthetically rich, intellectually kind of coherent way? Work, food, thought, culture.
Yeah, one of the nicest things about thinking about food, right, and possibly building a community of learners around food and thinking about food is that, like, I sometimes I think about like the way that in the Western canon and Western philosophy in particular, right, food is the thing. This is something that comes up in the dissertation a lot, right? Food is the thing that is done by. Thought is a leisure activity. It requires the presence of some class of people who are doing that work so that we can think about the real stuff or something. If you don't want to be an exploitative class that is just sort of relying on the sweat and tears of somebody else, right? Then you always have to do food first, right? And it's special, I think, to be thinking about food because, it's like I can barely get beyond what I'm going to eat that day, right? Much less like go on to think sort of quote unquote higher order questions. But if you are thinking about food and building an education around food, in many ways the way that you're doing it here, then you get to kind of stick around that starting point and realize that there's actually a rich there's a rich ground to be drawing up from right there. You don't have to go away from the kitchen. There's plenty to think about when you're working in the field and working in a kitchen. And so, there's a much smaller loop, right, where you're not just eating and then going out and then coming back and eating and then going out, but you're thinking all close to the very activity that you have to return to all the time.
Yeah. Recently I went and reread like the classic, maybe along with Walden, of the the Back to the Land movement. Helen and Scott Nearing's "Living the Good Life." Are you familiar with this text?
I'm not, no.
Oh, you should read it. It's,
Okay.
but anyway, this was a couple, Helen and Scott Nearing, who, in the depths of the Depression, and Scott Nearing had been a well-known kind of radical professor, like labor organizer, thinker about reorganization of the economy in various radical ways in that era when that was going on. A lot.
Right. Yeah.
But hit with the Depression, he was kind of blacklisted out of the university, and so he and his wife Helen, who was a high-level musician, they decided they were going to go to buy a farm in Vermont and figure out how to make a living there, do that. And then out of this came this book, Living the Good Life, which was, another generation or so later, when in the late 60s and 70s, people were going back to the land, and a lot of people came here to Viroqua. This was the book that was sitting on their shelf because it described a lot of the motivation and the idea for this, the vision of it, but also really practically how they did it. And they had a lot of, they have a lot of very idiosyncratic ideas. They only will build with stone and things that I'm not sure how many people actually applied, but they explained really seriously why they chose to do those things. I think the other thing that a lot of people remember from it and sticks out is their vision of the schedule of the day. So their vision of the day, they wanted to create a time when there was 4 hours a day, every day, whoever was staying with them was devoted to what they called bread labor.
Okay.
Right. And then another 4 hours or another part of the day, which was devoted to cash crops, right? And which in their case was maple syrup.
Okay.
But so they had some need to bring in some money, but the idea was that was was going to be minimized as much as possible by raising as much of their own food. And so they the structured time, they're going to do they're going to raise their food and also build their buildings in this part of the day. They're going to raise a little money, and then they would have all the rest of the time to do art or to write or to engage in politics or whatever it was. What's striking, of course, is that they're remembered for the parts about how to raise food, right? And that it is what they did during that bread labor time actually was their legacy and their impact on the world.
Yeah. It's I'm remembering now that there is one selection from this book that's in a reader that I used to teach in the environmental department that is specifically one of the chapters must be about food, right? Yeah. And what's really great about books like that, and then even a lot of cookbooks, right, is that there are all these very. I was looking at Gene Logston's book, All Flesh is Grass, last night in the library, and there is a whole genre of writing out there that is just practical explanations of what's happening, but woven into that is reflection. Reflection comes out of it, right? So as you're describing these things, more general principles start to emerge out of them, and so it's not as if yeah, in some sense, you can go off and do art and thought and music away from that. But even in those moments where you're thinking about the very practical, again, just go back to that higher laws thing, right? The reflection on that generates thought that is at least as important and maybe more important. It gives you the highest. It gives you the highest laws, right? Just in the margins between the description of how to butcher a chicken or how to prepare food or something. Right,
and Helen and Scott Nearing talk about making gravel, right? And it becomes philosophical, right? And that's Emerson says one of my favorite quotes that basically we need practical experiences, real to kind of push up against the physical world through our labor, in order to give bones to our thought, right? Without those that type of experience, we don't have substantiality to our thinking, right? And if you look at our language, it's filled with these very concrete metaphorical images that are drawn from tools, from natural experiences, from sports sometimes, right? And so archaic kind of crafts, right, which we encounter here through the folk school, are filled with words that then show up elsewhere in the language, right? We recently went and spent an afternoon with a woman who is training oxen, right? So we talked about yokes and ox bows, and how many other places do the language associated with it totally archaic, like a form of labor that most people have no concept of, are actually still in our language in lots of ways.
Yeah, and the one of these examples that sticks out the most to me that came up in or occurred to me in the writing of the dissertation, and it seems like one of those blind spots where you're like, how could I have missed this for so long, right? Is the amount of language that we have to describe knowledge and knowing are originally metaphors derived from things having to do with taste and eating, right? So sapere, right? It's like can trace this back to having the taste of things, right? Knowledge, in some sense, is just like having a sense of the essence of a thing, and we get at that most clearly through our taste of it, right? And then, of course, we just have
it goes back to Genesis, right? The fruit of knowledge, the tree of knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all already there. It's just a matter of taking off the blinders or stepping back a minute to see how so much of the language that we already use is derived from this very practical, down to earth, everyday experience of working on the land and eating food.
Yeah, so we're coming up towards the end of our hour here, and I think one thing I'd love to, maybe a concluding question is, so there's the provisioning, the preparation, the kind of the eating of the food. The other piece is hospitality, right? So thinking about this in the context very concretely of a microcollege or an educational program, talk about hospitality, and that then connects with the other, with the public. What other layer does that add to this picture?
So hospitality is, it's a difficult term to get at in today's world because it's so tied to the hospitality industry. It's so tied to, my partner was asking me about this last night. We were reading through a section in Emanuele Coccia's book, and this idea that he has that when we eat, we become, we host life in our bodies or something, right? And the question was, I thought hospitality had to do with, a kind of welcoming invitation into one's home or one's business or something, and it has become that, and it's become something that has to do with particularly a market exchange, right?
Right.
You can come into this and we will feed you if you can pay or if you have the right clothes on or whatever, right? But historically, the word you can trace it back to a whole nest of concepts that have to do with, hospes and hostess mean at once the guest, the host, the friend, the enemy. And so kind of in a more general sense, it just has to do with the encounter with the other. On Derrida's reading has to do with the encounter with the radically other, right? So not just the encounter with, the person that can pay for their entrance into our eating establishment or something, but, Derrida makes this point or makes this argument that like radical hospitality, pure hospitality, is something that like doesn't ask details of the other, right? Refers us back to the Greek tradition where when someone comes to your home, and asks for food and a place to stay, it is, uncouth to ask who they are or where they're from until you've given them a bath and given them a meal, right?
Much less their credit card.
Yeah.
Right.
So like allowing, right, hospitality in a sort of deep, robust sense means encountering the other and allowing them to be preserved in their otherness, right?
Yeah.
Without having to incorporate them or make them follow your rules, right? So we can from here think about questions of migration and immigration and refugees, where hospitality is like not just you can come into our country if you can speak our language or if you salute the flag or something, but this is somebody who needs help or is approaching us from a perspective or a position of vulnerability, and it's not up to us to try to make sense of them or to translate them into our own culture, but to that is to say to change them, right? But to in some sense put ourselves in a position of not necessarily subordination, but in a relation to them that again just allows them to persist in their own otherness. And I think that it's a concept that we could learn a lot from today, when there is so much homogenization of culture in a global market economy, right? Where the common language is money, right? Without, yeah.
Another concept, another way of living in the world that has been kind of violated by commerce is service, the service industry, right? In the same way, and that's I think part of what you're describing, right? To really be of service and to be the servant leader, whatever that is. Like that is a mode of like Christ washing people's feet, that sort of thing. Is now it's a commercial interaction, which feels very different in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the last sort of point of reference here for me is the great thinker of hospitality is in the 20th century is Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas, and Derrida both go so far, and this is where I think it all comes back to philosophy, right? In some sense, they make this argument that philosophy is first and foremost ethics, and because in some sense we have to make value judgments about the world before we can even start thinking rationally or logically, right? So the origin of philosophy, this really high order kind of otherworldly reflection, is the practical engagement that we have with others. And then they go on to make the claim that ethics is fundamentally hospitality. And so, if you follow that chain through, right, thinking hospitality and thinking the encounter with the other and the open question of how we engage, the ongoing question of how we engage with the other, that we make the case that philosophy as such, thought as such, is this project of trying to embody and enact hospitality. And I don't know, I think that that's a great line because it fits very nicely with the argument that I'm making, but it also shows the living significance of what we call philosophy. It's just learning how to be in a world with people who are radically different than us.
Yeah, it's such a powerful answer to that basic philosophical question of how shall we live, right? And if that's the core of a program like Thoreau College or a liberal education in general is if it's going to be practical, it's going to address that question. It's going to engage that question. So, well, Evan, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Really look forward to following where you go with this. These are powerful ideas. Thank you for coming to visit.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right.